Today, however, we're fortunate to have with us Colette Rausch, who is the Associate Vice President for Global Practice and Innovation in the United States Institute of Peace. And there she leads the development of new approaches for addressing violent extremism and promoting justice, security, and the rule of law. She has directed or participated in missions and projects in more than 24 countries, including Afghanistan, Iraq, Kosovo, Libya, Myanmar, Nepal, Nicaragua, Yemen, Senegal, and Sri Lanka. Before joining the Institute, Colette served as the Director of Human Rights and the Rule of Law in the Kosovo mission of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And earlier in her career, Colette worked for the U.S. Department of Justice as a program manager for Central and Eastern Europe, and before that as a federal prosecutor. She's also the, she received her JD from Santa Clara University School of Law, and she's also the editor of 2 different volumes, which after her talk today, she'll be signing if you'd like to purchase copies of her 2 books in the back room here. Her first book was Speaking Their Peace, Personal Stories from the Frontiers of War and Peace. And the second book is Fighting Serious Crimes, Strategies and Tactics for Conflict Societies. So I encourage you to stick around and get copies of the book afterward. Now join me in welcoming Colette Rausch.
Thank you, Professor Cornell Clayton, for your very warm welcome, and thanks to everybody who came today. I'm assuming it's not just the pizza and the sodas, but if that's what drew you, then that's great. I'm very happy to be here. As was mentioned, my name is Colette Rausch, and I'm from Washington, D.C., and an institute called the United States Institute of Peace. How many of you here have heard of the United States Institute of Peace? 2. Good. Okay. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the U.S. Institute of Peace. USIP is based in Washington, D.C. It was established by Congress in 1984, and it was set up by statute, and it was based upon the principle that peace is possible. And the Institute provides resources, tools, training, and assistance to individuals around the world and organizations who are working on conflict resolution efforts, whether that's conflict prevention, helping to rebuild after violent conflict, and most importantly, trying to prevent conflict from starting again. And my work has been focused primarily on what we call rule of law, or setting up justice, security, and rule of law systems. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about one of my favorite topics, which is fighting serious crimes. But before, I just want to say how happy I am to be at WSU. My husband graduated from here just a couple years ago, actually many years ago. And he talks about it all the time. He worked on the newspaper, and also he insists that we watch the Apple Cup every year, and puts on his jersey, which is looking pretty raggedy at this point. So I bought him something new so that he can look a little bit more modern and not wear his old jersey. So I'm very happy here to be here to actually see where he spent his formative years, what he remembers of it. He was a communications study major, and he said that there was a lot of socializing at WSU. So what I wanted to talk about is why I became so interested in the issue of fighting serious crimes. What happened is many years ago when I was at the Justice Department as a prosecutor, I was asked if I would like to go to Bosnia and to work with the Bosnians when they were just coming out of their war, and help to set up and train judges and prosecutors on international standards related to human rights and also criminal procedure and criminal law. And then later I was sent to Kosovo through our State Department. And what was very interesting is, having come from the United States in a formal justice system, very much we're very blessed with what we have here, and you take it for granted. And if there's a challenge, then oftentimes people will talk about passing laws, training judges, and very, very technical things. And that's what we were told when we were first sent out to both Bosnia and Kosovo. But what happened when we arrived in Kosovo was we found we were completely ill-prepared for the task. And we quickly saw that what was going on in the aftermath of Kosovo, and I don't know how many people know what had happened in Kosovo. Some of you, that's great. So in short, what was going on is Kosovo was a province of the former Yugoslavia, and more specifically part of Serbia. And there were over a decade, there was a period of taking away the rights of the Kosovo Albanians, and the Kosovo Albanians creating a movement in order for independence. And then it became a more armed movement. And so you had the conflict between the Kosovo Albanians, or the Kosovo Liberation Army, and then the Serbian authorities. And over a period of time, there was a ethnic cleansing on behalf of the Serb authorities to push out a lot of the Kosovo Albanians who fled over into Macedonia and into Albania, the country of Albania. And so when we arrived, you can imagine what we found. And I came on the heels of the NATO forces and arrived a few days afterwards. And what we found was over a period of time, the Serbian authorities had basically taken over all the institutions. They were the police, they were the judges, they were the prosecutors. So when they fled, there was no system of justice whatsoever. There were no functioning courts. But what also we found is once a war ends, a war does not completely end. It does not mean the end of hostilities or the end of violence. And so very quickly, right underneath our noses, you could start to see that there were revenge killings, and there was political violence. And so you could see that some of the Serbian judges and officials who had decided to stay because they'd grown up in Kosovo, they were being targeted. And you could see some of the Kosovo Albanians who had maybe, or were being seen as aligned with the Serbs, were being targeted. And there were killings, and there were kidnappings, and there were thefts of different apartments. And so while all this was going on, many of us felt powerless because it was a period of time when there was what we call a security vacuum. And then even as the UN started to come online, as NATO forces started to organize in order to try to keep security, still there was political violence. And when I ended up moving there, one morning my apartment rattled, with the windows were rattling, threw me to the floor. And what had happened is a bomb had gone off just right down the street from where I was living, and it had targeted a Serbian institution. So you could see political violence, and you could see this kind of sorting out of politics was happening, not just against the Serbian authorities that still had a very tiny presence there, but also Kosovo Albanian on Kosovo Albanian, and some of the different political factions. And so this became a mission that many of us who had been there had, to try to learn the lessons, to learn from the challenges that we faced, so that then when we came back, and this was everyone from human rights activists to military, to judges, lawyers, to non-governmental organization, legal systems monitoring, NGOs, we all came together to try to create a handbook that would help people when they went into situations, whether they were from the country or coming from the outside, if they were the UN, would have some kind of guidebook to understand what they're going to face. So these are not technical challenges, these are very human challenges that the conflict, whatever drove the conflict to begin with, will often be found after the conflict is completed. So we looked at what were some of the things that can be done when you're faced with serious crimes. And what we mean by serious crimes is certainly every crime is serious when you're the victim. So it isn't that certain crimes matter more than others, but when we looked at serious crimes, what we looked at are what are those crimes that can literally tear a society apart. Already societies are vulnerable, and the social fabric is torn apart when there's been violence. And even more so if you had political actors who are using politics of hate and fear and division to win over their group or to win elections, you're even talking about a more polarized environment and a more fragile society. And so when we talk about serious crimes, we look at those crimes that can destroy the peace that might be building in a society, those that are very threatening to peace and stability and preventing a society from moving forward. And these are criminal acts that usually when you're looking at conflict-affected societies, you're looking at serious crimes proliferating along the same lines of those that drove the conflict. So in Kosovo is ethnic violence, religious violence, and in some areas it could be religiously generated violence depending upon the dynamics. And so these are the types of crimes that we look at when we talk about serious crimes. And also the important thing to remember, as I said, there's always a vacuum. And what happens in a period of time, in each country in which I've worked, there's this kind of golden hour that I would say. So when I first arrived in Kosovo, or even when I first arrived in Libya, when Gaddafi was removed from power, and there was this period of euphoria with people in Libya, or in Kosovo, there was this period of euphoria where they felt that now things are going to change, active conflict has ended. And in each context, there's this period where it's stable. Even in Iraq, when a lot of my colleagues first came in, there was a period of stability, but it's usually just long enough for certain forces to mobilize and then fill the vacuum. And those who fill the vacuum, criminal organized gangs, politically motivated actors. Oftentimes you can't distinguish between the two. They may benefit from each other, so a lot of political actors you would see in Kosovo were using some of the criminal gangs in order to carry out their activities. Same thing in Libya. You were seeing militias that were being used by political actors for their own gain. So many times they're intertwined. And so it's so important for society and for people to counteract those forces in the vacuum and to try to fill the vacuum with justice, security, rule of law, and peace-building measures. So a lot of the work that we do at the Institute is to try to work within that space, or afterwards to try to have peace get roots that can't be pulled out, while other forces benefit from violent conflict, either for political or financial or other means. So when we look at what are the things that could be done, of course there are certain things that could be done in order to try to fill the vacuum. And some of those could include things like bringing together individuals to pass new laws, to train judges and prosecutors, to work with police to not engage in abusive behavior, especially when it's dealing with violent extremism or other things that could then, by violating the rights of certain groups, then just proliferates more groups who then want to engage in violent extremism. So working with police to follow the guidelines of rule of law. So there are a lot of technical things that an institution can do. But there's also very, very, very important things that individuals can do. And one thing that individuals can do is to follow the principles of rule of law. And I'm just going to, first of all, when I say rule of law, what comes to mind? How would you define rule of law? When you hear people, you hear rule of law a lot at times. Yes?
The laws that are related to like a certain issue, the rules on like the codes, the code of law on like certain specific topics or specific violations.
Yeah, exactly. Following those written rules that society or your legislature has set forth. Exactly. What's another dimension of rule of law? Yes?
So specifically the rule of law has to do with authority figures following those rules that are set for them. If you are in a position of power, you can't just usurp the laws that have been set forth.
Exactly. That it's all people, no matter who you are, where you sit, whatever walk of life, you are held accountable just like everybody else. Exactly. And that actually they call a thin and thick definition. A thin definition is a very technical definition, and it's the definition of laws in courts and pass through due process. That's important. But the thicker definition is more about the quality of the law and how is it applied, and is it applied equally, and are all people held accountable. So the thin definition could be this is literally this long, and the thick is literally this long. So a lot of times people will shorten it to the thin, but in reality the importance is the thicker definition of how people realize and how laws are perceived. When I was in Kosovo, if you just read the laws on the books, they looked good. for the most part, they followed international standards, and we find this a lot. But how they were applied was completely different depending upon who you were, how powerful you were, and that was the problem, and that was the drivers of a lot of the discontent in society. So I'm going to play a video that talks about the larger, thicker definition of rule of law. Nope, I'm not. Now I am. Or maybe.
Rule of law, it means we're all equal in front of the law.
When everybody is free to say what they want, justice.
Rule of law is holding people accountable to the law.
The law must emanate from the people. Look, if the law lives in the consciousness of the people. If you don't have that, you don't live.
In countries where the rule of law is absent, ordinary people do not have access to the justice system. Imagine you're walking down the street and you're suddenly approached by plainclothes police officers from a secret security agency. You're taken to a prison, you're tortured, you're abused, you're held without any legal grounds, and you have just simply disappeared.
The rule of law emanates from the people of a nation. Yet there are countries where the rule of law is not a common practice.
Without the rule of law, you have a nation where its citizens' fundamental rights and well-being are not protected.
The United States Institute of Peace believes that rule of law is the lifeblood of a society.
One example of how we bring in voices of the people into the process is through justice and security dialogue, where we bring citizens, government, police, and others together to build trust, identify the rule of law challenges, and come up together with joint solutions and strategies.
The rule of law is more than about one person, or even groups of people. The rule of law is a process, but once constructed can be enduring.
What we're seeing in the world is people's demand for a voice in decisions that affect their lives. For a society that provides justice, security, and accountability for everyone. In other words, a society that abides by the rule of law. So when you, going back to thinking about rule of law, who do you think are, the most important individuals in order to ensure that rule of law is adhered to in a society?
Law enforcement.
Law enforcement's one, exactly.
I will say that all the different people are equally important, like the citizens, the judges, and people in the government.
Citizens, government officials, law enforcement. Exactly. So what's really critical is many times the countries in which I'm working in look up and look to the government or look to political actors as the holders of the justice, security, and rule of law. And what's very powerful in many of the societies is when it's actually civil society and individuals who are part of the community are full actors in that process. And so what you'll hear about is this concept of culture of lawfulness. So culture of lawfulness means that it's also individuals are adhering to the law, and individuals are also contributing and being part of it. And a lot of this came from years ago in Sicily, when there was a big mob problem. And I'm originally from Nevada, and I lived in Las Vegas for 10 years. That's where I was a prosecutor. And so you heard a lot about the organized crime and the mafia. And what happened in Sicily is the organized criminal gangs and many government officials had become so intertwined and kind of captured society that eventually over time people came together, and it started with the Catholic Church, because at the time that that was a very powerful actor, and mothers, and they started to come together and demand change and demand that certain activities cease. At the same time, within the community, people stopped engaging in certain small corruption factors that had become a way of life. And that's where things started to change in parts of Sicily. And that's where the culture of lawfulness movement had been created. And so what we started to see in many of the communities is some of the things where, for example, in Nepal where I worked, you were talking about the different actors. What had happened in Nepal is they'd had a war and a 10-year Maoist insurgency. And a lot of that was being driven by marginalization of certain groups, power differentials and inequities. But also the grievances were being stoked by political actors, who ironically, the leaders had come from some of the same structures that they were fighting against. And so a lot of those groups were stoking grievances and creating basically a whole Maoist force that, tens of thousands of killed over a period of time. When the war ended, at that point, splinter insurgencies were starting when we were first starting to work there, and you could see it starting to happen. And they were starting to fill that vacuum. And a really interesting thing happened. At that point, a lot of the human rights activists started to feel like this has got to stop, because we didn't go against all of the conflict and the problems to then have it spin out again after we finally got a peace agreement. But their partners in this were the police, because the police had been on the front line and had taken a lot of hits. And the interesting thing is, right after the conflict ended, the citizens started coming to the streets and protesting and mobilizing. And there had been a huge clash between the police and the human rights community and the journalists. And some of the protesters had been killed, and some of the police had been injured. But the fascinating thing about it was some of the open-minded groups on both sides actually started to talk about their grievances. The police, who felt like they were kind of put out there on the front line, the human rights activists who felt like they were not getting the traction that they needed, and they joined forces and they started engaging in dialogue instead of competition. And they started engaging in dialogue where they started to identify some of the problems in their communities. And even though the higher political actors at the time were not interested, because they were more interested at that point in elections and who was going to take control, at local levels, they started to work together. And over time, the fascinating thing was their movement grew. And pretty soon, other police and other communities wanted to do what they were doing, because when splinter groups or political violence groups were trying to agitate people and divide them and stir up trouble, the communities were able to hold together when the communities were coming together. And there were two areas, one where the civil society, the government officials, police were all communicating and solving problems and holding together. The one literally next door hadn't. And when I visited one, everything was intact. When I visited the other one, buildings and government buildings had been burned down, because when some of the political actors were trying to stoke divisions again, one group held together, the other one didn't in the town next to it. So you saw this very visceral example of unity and people holding together. So that's where, as we talk about the importance of the government doing what they need to do, being accountable to laws and applying the laws equally, it's equally important for citizens to do their best to kind of step up and be able to cross lines and cross divisions. So I'm just going to mention a few of the things, and then I'm going to show one last video. So some of the things that we've seen different individuals do, and it's been really heartening to see this in their own communities. And I think that these are things that are relevant for all communities, and one that are in conflict. And one of them is when people try to work to understand other groups. And even though there are grievances and challenges, when somebody steps up and crosses the aisle or crosses the bridge and tries to understand, it doesn't mean one has to accept it, or agree, but tries to understand, to work for a higher purpose of building peace so they're not divided. And also exploring the differences and trying to understand. And it's interesting because I'm from the West, and when I was from the West, my view of Washington, D.C. was very different. And then when I'm in Washington, D.C., I have a much different understanding of the West. And it was that type of thing where you're from, you make certain assumptions about the rest of the world or, you know, the rest of the country until you start to experience it. And so a lot of folks were exploring differences. They were visiting neighborhoods that they never visited. People in Nepal who came from certain caste systems, the higher castes, so they had access to education, they had access to resources, started to visit some of what they call the lower caste in the south of Nepal. And they went to areas that they had never gone to, just to understand and see the differences, because we all get very myopic and closed when we're in our own societies. And another is to connect with the victimized groups and to try to find out what it is that's driving the grievances and what is it that maybe can be done to help. And then the last is really to work with others. I worked for a number of years in Libya and Yemen during what was called the Arab Spring. And it was very hard for a lot of the young activists, and as well as some of the police and others who saw a vision for a new world and were very excited at this opportunity. When the door slammed, and Libya basically has been embroiled in a civil war, militia groups for the past few years, and then Yemen, which is just completely shut down any opportunities and the war that's going on there. And so what happened is even now, some of those folks that were working aren't able to work actively. Obviously, it's not safe, but they're starting to at least connect with each other, to kind of have relationships and connect with each other, waiting for the day that they hope that whatever seeds that were planted before, they will be able to start again. So it's just keeping that network and keeping people working together, because a lot of people who are working for change or in peace building, it can be very isolating at times and it can be very difficult. So working with other people. And there was one woman in Libya who really epitomized what somebody can do. A lot of times when I work with peace builders in other countries, or I work with justice sector people, they think that they need to do big things. They need to, solve all the world's problems. And even as a prosecutor, I naively thought, when I was a baby prosecutor, we had a lot of telemarketers in Las Vegas, Nevada, and they were victimizing elderly people around the country and even up into Canada. And I actually thought that if I prosecuted enough people, that we could stop the telemarketing problem and crime would stop. Now, I admit this was probably not a very realistic thing, but I was very idealistic. And what I came to realize is it's going to continue on. As long as human beings are human beings, we will continue to have divisions, we will continue to have challenges. But that you can do small things. So as a prosecutor, I felt like if I at least work with agents to do search warrants, and that we're adhering to the rule of law and due process, and I can teach them how to do good search warrants, that may not be earth-shattering, but it's a step. It's a planting of the seed. And so goes back to many of the countries in which I've worked, how it doesn't have to be big things that people do. It can be very small things that may seem small, but they could be very profound. And so Salwa is the person that I want to talk about. In the book that was referenced earlier, Speaking Their Peace, we talked about 100 people from all different countries, and it was more journalistic in nature, just to ask them what the challenges were, what advice they have for international actors, what their experiences were, and how they think conflict can be prevented. And the thing that was so interesting to me was, despite all of the challenges that so many people went through and what was happening in their countries, how there was hope even in small actions. And so Salwa I met in Libya, and at the time this was right after, as I mentioned before, Gaddafi had been removed, and the militias were starting to take control. So it was becoming very unstable. And when we were there, there were rocket-propelled grenade fights in front of our hotels. things because this is what they were used to, the militias were, and they were now fighting it out in the streets. And so individuals were trying to figure out what could they do to, create peace within their neighborhoods. And so Salwa said she thought long and hard about it, and when I was in Benghazi, I went to this museum, and I saw all this metal, and you can see here some of these figures. And what had happened is this man here had been, during the revolution, he had been at night under cover of darkness making improvised weapons for the revolution he's a welder, using metal. But afterwards, there was all this scrap metal from different bombs, different weapons. And so he took, his way of building peace was he took all the scrap metal and he made all of these little statues. And it was just, there were hundreds of them, little statues, big statues. And they also did it a way of healing, because a big challenge in the countries in which we work is trauma, societal, individual, and community trauma. You can't go through something like what many of the people have and not have it impact you. And so for him, his therapy was to take the broken pieces of metal and things that had caused so much damage to people and to try to build something new. And he had made a Don Quixote and a donkey that I took home. And a woman named Salwa didn't have the welding skills. So what she did is she made this pink car. So she took a Jeep that had been used in the conflict, she painted it pink, and she put flowers on it. And so what brought her happiness was something small like that people then would walk by, and it would bring smiles to the faces of the children. So it's just examples like that really gave me a lot of hope and showed me the small actions that people take can make such a big difference. So I'm gonna just do a little bit from Salwa.
It's burned, it's cut, it's broken, but I want to use it to make a piece of art. It's very important. It's a full message to wounded, the people that lost their members, and many of them they got depressed because they're very young and they lost like their leg or leg. So I just wanted to give them the message like even if you are broken, you're not made like your life is not over. Like your life continues and you can be a part of the country. This is the message he wants to. That's why he loves the broken things, like because we all have this like these failures and these scars inside, but it doesn't mean that we have these scars. The people they have to throw us. Like we are here and we are a part of this life.
So picking up on what Salwa talked about, just in conclusion, what really moves me in the work that I do is traveling to places like where Salwa's from in Libya and meeting people and seeing just how powerful one person can be in their actions, literally just their kindness to each other, or how they try to transcend the difficulties and how transformative that can be, and how easy it is to kind of get sucked into the darkness and the conflict, but how it can also be one person can be transformative, and how one person can help knit together the social fabric, and when many people work together, how that can be held together in a society that's been affected by conflict. So thank you. Okay.
So we have about 20 minutes for questions and answers. Maybe I'll start us off. I think you're absolutely right. The rule of law has less to do with the formal structures of law and statutes and constitutions, things like that. It has to do with culture, right? And we know that it's really important to develop a culture of democratic, law-like behavior are mediating institutions. And those are sometimes the first things that go in conflicts and dictatorships. So specifically, is there something that the Institute looks for rebuilding these mediating institutions between the state and the individual? And how can we foster that in a post-conflict society?
No, that's a great question, because the reality is, in an ideal world, we know the institutions can help ensure, if run properly, ensure that rule of law stands. At the same time, it can be captured by political forces and used against people to break rule of law. So what you'll hear in our work is you'll hear this term of top-down or bottom-up. So top-down means you work with institutions, and if you get them strong, then it will just naturally flow, and then everything will be well. We know that doesn't work, as we've spent years in the former Soviet Union and countries trying to pass laws and trying to do reforms, that isn't changing things. So then people say, okay, that doesn't work, let's do bottom-up. And so they'll say bottom-up means we have to rely on civil society groups and the strength of the people, the power of the people, nonviolent action movements. That needs to happen, and that needs to take care of things. That alone doesn't work either. And so over time, what we're coming to is it's a top-down, bottom-up, and in the middle all the way out. So that's where I come with this justice and security dialogue, and a colleague of mine who works on nonviolent action. And she'll even say she believes in people power, nonviolent action, but she knows that if they're just out there and people are protesting, that's important, but it doesn't get the tentacles into the institutions that need to be built. So that's where justice, security dialogue, other dialogue methods, what they're starting to come to is my colleagues with nonviolent action are starting to work with the peace builders and realizing that you need to work across the lines, you need to work across the institutions and pull like-minded people from different institutions and to be able to build coalitions and move from that end. And to realize, like some of the nonviolent action folks, like in Nepal and others, human rights activists thought, I'm not going to work with the police and security forces, they're part of the problem. And the police were like, I'm not going to work with those human rights activists who are throwing stones at us and they don't get the problems. And the reality is, these are not monolithic organizations. There were some people in the human rights group that didn't have the best interests. There were police who did have the best interests or didn't. So they started to form coalitions across lines, across parties to create a mass. I call it like a boat theory, like get as many as you can on the boat who are willing to cross them. Because the forces of division, the way you can always succeed is just divide and conquer. So it's to get those who can get past some of the perceived differences and pull it together, if that makes sense to what you were asking. Yes, sir.
I really enjoyed your presentation, and it converges with this finding your voice is very interesting in lots of fields, and I think it's of a piece with what you were saying, different piece, but of a piece that torture victims will lose their voice. You know, they can't speak even after the torture is over, and part of the recovery is finding your voice. But my question for you is, it sounds like the ideal model is something like a really great town hall meeting, where side A says they get to say their case, and side B gets to say their case, and still some side wins, right? So side A wins, but then the model is something like side B says, well, at least we got to have our voice. Boy, I said my piece, but since I got that, it's okay for them to win? Does that ever really happen? Or don't they just say like, okay, well the side A's wrong, and they can't see that they're wrong? I'm worried that it's tempting to overvalue just speaking your mind.
Yeah, that speaking your mind, overvalue the power of that alone.
Right. Yeah. Rather than, does that ever really solve it?
Not always. So I think it also did, like in Libya, it didn't, because there were forces greater than that. Weapons and power and authority at that point, and there wasn't enough of a nexus there because it had been torn apart in Libya. Civil society for 40 years had been torn apart. Whereas in Nepal, they'd already had a 10-year period of trying to build good governance. So they had a stronger base upon which to build. So it isn't a panacea for everything, depending upon the history of the conflict in individuals, and also what happens with neighboring countries. In Libya, neighboring countries were also feeding into the conflict by arming certain militia groups. But I always say, that's why it's being optimistic and realistic, but understanding that if you don't at least have optimism and know what you're building towards, even if you have to go dormant for a little bit, then you're never gonna get there.
Thank you for being here today. So I was just kind of wondering on the piece of rule of law. The United States kind of has this idea that you lead by example globally, and so in a democracy, the adherence to the rule of law is very important. And I think a lot of people bring up concerns with the current administration and how they uphold the rule of law, and so I'm just wondering how do you think we're doing with that?
Yeah, with the work, first of all, I need to say all the things that I'm saying are my personal opinion and do not represent the views of my organization or the U.S. government. So what the challenge is, and we do, all the work that we do is overseas. So by mandate, we're not allowed to work domestically. So all the work that we do is overseas. And over time, when we have done the work, we do get asked, and this is, I've been at the Institute for 14 years, so this even predates. I've been through 3 administrations. And each time, we are always asked by our interlocutors overseas about what's going on in our own country. And I do some work with our military lawyers where we go overseas and work with individuals to train on human rights and the international humanitarian law, international studies. And we always get this question because the military lawyers will say to our lawyers, you had Abu Ghraib. So why are you here coming over to our country to tell us what to do? And what I always say is it's 2 things. One is every country has struggles, including our own country. And the rule of law is not permanent. And just like the video with the justice saying that it can be fragile, and it's critical that as a society we adhere and we hold it up because it can start to fall apart. But the thing is, the most important thing is that even if things slide, that we follow through and hold people accountable. So that's where with Abu Ghraib, the military lawyers would say, look, this happened, it shouldn't have happened, this was wrong, and here's what we do for accountability. So it's not that things are perfect, but that there is accountability. And that it will, swing back and forth at times. And that I feel like in our country, what I've always said is I feel like in our country, there is the foundation that is there, and it's critical that everybody learn that again and make sure that that's upheld.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you for coming today. And I really enjoyed your speech. And I think you raised some good points, and also some parts I don't agree with, but that doesn't matter. As you said, you have been to Kosovo. What's your opinion? What's your conclusion from there? What do you think will happen in the future over there?
Yeah, it's very difficult because one could argue that Kosovo was doing well because it's not an active war. So one could say it was a success because the war stopped. Challenge, though, is if you talk to the people who live there, especially the youth, they feel like it's been captured by a political criminal activity. So that still, unless you're part of a certain family or have certain contacts, you don't have the opportunities to get the job. And so it's not active war, but could one say that rule of law is blossoming there? One could not say that.
I'm from Serbia.
Yeah.
So I pretty much know what's going on over there. And I don't think it's right what's going on, because like, when you said you have been there and you said you saw the institutions in Serbia, I mean, it's part of Serbia, so might as well. It's like, oh, I come to US and say, oh, I'm surprised because we have institutions from US. So, of course, there will be institutions from Serbia because the country, it won't be from Japan. But that was a little like confused for me, like, what did you expect? And also, like, I feel like they did not pay attention really well on all the people there. I think that's really wrong, because like, of course, our government probably they did not like take care of minorities as they should, and that's probably why all these things happening right now. But also, I think that's wrong side from our government. But also, I feel like neither sides are not right. So like, I'm doubting it. I'm like trying to understand it, but it's like so hard, and also like there is so much pressure I feel from European Union, because like Serbia is trying to get into the European Union right now, and the case is like they're like making it conditions, like they're saying, okay, if you give up Kosovo as a territory, yeah, you can be free and go to the European Union. But isn't it like too much maybe?
Yeah, and you make a very good point.
I agree with you. Okay, yeah, there is a problem, and I agree they did not take care of things like they should, obviously. But like, is that really like that? Like,
Yeah, and the challenge, you bring up a point that in conflict resolution, there are many layers. And so the political nature of it is sometimes impossible to reconcile, like you mentioned. So the political nature of the status of Kosovo struck to the heart of identity of people. And it was that identity that then drove the conflict. So in reality, there's no way to square that circle. And so that's why things are still never fully settled in a society.
But do you think it would be fully settled if Kosovo stayed independent of either of countries? Or do you think it should be like, because like there will link so many like Serbian people too, not just Albanians in the past. So like I feel like, okay, now because like Albanians are like, both of the sides is like crazy. They're like trying to like, they're like destroying everything. So like I feel like, and also I know a lot of Serbians who just like escape from there.
Yeah.
Like we didn't want to stay there anymore because it's just too much. They cannot live in that environment. So like, do you feel that like because of all this escaping part, there is not so many like Serbian people anymore. So like, is it supposed to be like that, or is it good people to just like this?
I mean, time will tell. And now Kosovo's independent, so it's its own country. Yeah, exactly.
But I think they will solve the problem.
It's, as I mentioned, I think Kosovo, like a lot of places, there will always be some challenges that, if not managed properly, could spark into violent conflict over time. And we've seen that in every society, and that's a challenge. Sorry.
I have rather a basic question. My question is like sometimes I see that there are certain childhood behavior, like in childhood experiences that influences a person's criminal behavior. And although everyone has a right to raise a family the way they want to raise it, but again, is there something that an institution or government can do to prevent crime at that level? That, crime, because once a person has acquired a certain nature, it's very difficult to change it, right? So, just a basic question.
Yeah, it's a very complex basic question, and I'm gonna talk about one dimension of it. Certainly, one could argue there's a justice system, but more and more, what I've been starting to look at, which I never thought as a lawyer I would be looking at this. It's like unwinding the onion like society and laws, and then you're like, wait, there's a human part, and then there's the trauma, and there's the history, there's narratives, there's societal narratives that feed into conflict. But there's more and more work on neuroscience and epigenetics that looks at how children experience their world in utero as well as in the early years, that then can help form and frame certain things that that can cause trauma. For example, there were studies of children in parents during 9/11, and children that were born during that period of time had certain nervous systems that were agitated. I'm just not using the technical terms, and that made sense because the body is there to survive. And so if you think you're coming to a world that's hostile and dangerous, you may be wired for survival. And so there's a lot more work being done on peace building neuroscience, and we gave a grant to the Alliance for Peace Building that's looking at these issues, and neuroscientists are saying, is there a way to rewire the brain for peace? So if you've grown up in conflict, even in cities where there's gang violence, it's not just in a war zone, but if you're in a neighborhood where there's a lot of crime and violence, how that neurobiology of your system is affected can have profound ways of finding ways to get out of it, or that can perpetuate violence. So I think that's a really interesting area for those of you who are more science and neuroscience minded. That will be really interesting, of rewiring. It can be wired for violence, can it be rewired for peace?
Quick question. As you were talking about the processes involved in peace building, I was thinking of two cases that I've been reading a bit about recently, and maybe you could speak to them a little. First is Northern Ireland and the peace process there, and the relative success of that, with the help of massive institutions and loads of support, and how that compares with the Palestine question now and the intractability of some of these conflicts. Where do you see the role of the Institute and these key processes in maybe helping with that latter one especially?
Yeah.
So it's a big question.
Yeah, it's a big question, and it's interesting because people study and people look at why this and why not that. And I honestly don't think anybody can say for certain. You can say certain things. Northern Ireland was interesting. I'd worked with Lord Ashdown, who had helped work on the peace process, and he talked about what Northern Ireland did is actually very different than the peace processes I've been engaged in that's had a lot of international support. It actually was so slow moving. They didn't even talk about police by design. Yet we go into peace processes and immediately, come on everybody, one year, let's get everything fixed. Not realizing, and Lord Ashdown is a psychiatrist, so he understood what was driving the IRA, what was happening in the communities. He was looking at it holistically and not just as a technical exercise. But at the same time, as we know in Northern Ireland, there was the criminal activity that still continued by both groups, and we're still seeing tensions and violence. And will that explode again? We don't know. So my own personal theory is until there's an environment where, for whatever reason, it cannot be forced from the outside, hands down. It cannot be rushed. And so at the end of the day, if something is gonna evolve, it has to evolve internally. And it has to be, Northern Ireland was owned by Northern Ireland. And because they were in much better condition to do it. I think we come into countries and just expect too much, too fast, and then overpower what might be created organically. And then the second thing is, until we look at it holistically and understand the ecosystem, it's a complex system. And unless we understand what is happening here influences over here, like I talked about the neuroscience or the laws, instead, if we look at things in very narrow ways, then we're not going to succeed. So it's not an answer, it's more of a framework for looking at it. But I don't think anybody can really say they know. We're still learning.
So we have time for one more question.
Okay. Can we do two quick?
Okay.
Okay. It's because they were both really quick.
So you talked a little bit about what an individual person can do to kind of create that change, crossing the aisle and
thinking more as a community, but how do you sort of move that sentiment outside? I feel like most people in conflict, there will always be people who immediately think that way and don't have to be taught to think that way. So how do you move that sentiment onto like the fringes of a community?
Engagement, absolute engagement. So many times, people-to-people programs, exchanges, those are so profound. It's having that experiential relationship. That's, I think, and that's not perfect. It's because we know that you can't change someone's mind. I'm not going to say it works automatically, and oftentimes it doesn't, but if there is a chance, it's having exposure.
So you're talking about serious crime in a post-conflict region. Is that like the only factor that's obstructing peace in this area, or are there other factors like contributing to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, because I'm really interested in agriculture, I would just like to know
Yeah.
like what impact does agriculture have in like promoting peace in certain regions? Because I feel like if you can fill the needs like food, water, shelter, it makes a lot less opportunity for negative things like serious crime to happen.
Yeah, and if you look at the hierarchy of human needs, what's interesting is when we did the book, Speaking Their Peace, we went there, so what you think of rule of law, everything everyone cared about, can I eat? Can I send my child to school? And are they going to have a better life than I'm going to have? Hands down. So absolutely. And even as a different way of agriculture, it's also looking at agriculture as a way, just like art therapy, as agriculture and planting as a way of dealing through trauma.
Yeah.
I know every time I come back from a trip, I have a community garden, I'm in the dirt all the time.
Yeah.
It's like, it's really fundamental. So it's also using it as a tool for healing.
Okay, so I'm afraid our time is up. Before I ask you and joining me in thanking our guest, let me remind you that we have a panel discussion on life after conviction on Friday at noon here in the Foley Institute. I want to encourage you to come to that. Now, let me thank you all for coming out today, and join me now in thanking Colette Rausch for being here.